Good morning, everybody, and Hag Sameach. It is right in the middle of Passover, and I happen to be sitting at the Citadel, where next week on April 23rd, that's a Wednesday, uh, we will be we will be doing our Yom HaShoah annual Holocaust commemoration to honor the folks in Charleston whose families were murdered in the Shoah, and this year we're at capacity already. So if you were not able to register yet, you can still sign up for our wait list. And if anybody cancels their ticket, they'll be able to accommodate you. We also will have other options available leading up to the program for folks to participate if they can't be there in person. But we'll share more about that later. Today, we have Bridges Not Walls. This is our monthly community relations vlogcast for the Charleston Jewish Federation. And the goal is to give y'all a sneak peek into some of the incredible interfaith and bridge building conversations that we have as a federation out in the field every day. And I try to curate some of the most interesting people for you all to hear from. And today is no exception. Um, I have had the pleasure several times now of visiting the Anne Frank Center up in Columbia after lobbying on the Hill, and the experiences, or lobbying at the State House, and the experiences combined really highlight how important the work of the Anne Frank Center is. The Anne Frank Center in Columbia is the only Anne Frank Center outside of the original Anne Frank House in Amsterdam, the only one in the United States. And we happen to have it right here in Columbia, South Carolina. They have a mission to tell Anne Frank's story, and you'll hear more about that in a second. But especially leaving the State House, where we're advocating for nonprofit security grant funding through the Pray Safe Act for places of worship that are under attack because anti-Semitism is on the rise, and hate crimes legislation, where our state is considering how it wants to treat those kinds of crimes in the judicial system. And to visit the Anne Frank Center after lobbying for both of those priorities, it just highlights how we are still mightily struggling with some of the same issues that we were struggling with, that our ancestors were struggling with. So today we have a really special guest. He's Dr. Doyle Stevick. He is the executive director of the Anne Frank Center. And when folks ask me why the only Anne Frank Center in the world is in Columbia, South Carolina, the answer is really Dr. Doyle Stevick. Despite not being Jewish, he has taken an interest in the story of Anne Frank and the Holocaust, and really made it his life's mission to tell her story, and try to get to the root of what caused the Shoah in a way that folks who aren't Jewish can understand. But it's an incredible story, and so after hearing it the last time we were up in Columbia, I invited him to appear today. So with no further ado, we have with us Dr. Doyle Stevick. Welcome, sir.
Good morning. Pleasure to be with you.
Oh, the pleasure is ours, and we're grateful for the work that you are doing up in Columbia at the Anne Frank Center. Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got started telling Anne Frank's story.
Thank you. That's maybe a 30-minute question, so this could get us going. So my name is Doyle Stevick. I'm a professor of education, associate professor at the College of Education at USC, and I've had a long journey getting to where I am. So I grew up in Pittsburgh, went through Penn State to Indiana University. I had the pleasure and privilege to study abroad in Greece, and just loved that. I loved the cultural exchange, loved being in other societies and cultures. At the same time, I realized while it was thrilling for me, it was uncomfortable for some others. Those encounters with differences, not everybody was open to them in the same ways I was. And I went through Indiana University, worked in archaeology around the Mediterranean. My time in Israel was really spent primarily in archaeology, digging up Megiddo, the site where we get the word Armageddon. And so I've had experience in Israel in the 90s. But it was when I was at Indiana University that I had some of my first encounters. I found a white supremacist pamphlet thrown in my driveway. And that was probably spring of 1999, could have theoretically been fall. And it just seemed like such nonsense to me. And I thought, oh, I'll keep this and I'll, expose what nonsense this is. But I was busy and put it on a shelf and kind of forgot about it. I ended up finding it again some months later, threw it away. But by the time I learned that it was one of my own students who had thrown it in my driveway, it was already too late. That was the spring where on Hitler's birthday, April 20th, the Columbine attacks occurred. And it wasn't clear whether they were kind of Nazi sympathizers at first or motivated by these kind of hateful ideologies. But that really shook up our imaginations about violence and school shootings and what was possible. And by summer, this student of mine who had failed out of my class, it turned out had fallen in with a white supremacist cult. And he focused his hatred first and foremost on the Jewish people. So he ambushed 6 men and boys who were walking to Friday night services in Chicago, the July 4th weekend of 1999. And that was a starting point for a 3-day terror shooting spree across Illinois and Indiana, where he shot 11 people and killed 2. And in that set of attacks, he started by attacking the Jewish community. Then he murdered Ricky Birdsong, who was the former black basketball coach of Northwestern University, while he was with his kids in a park or the front yard. And then he murdered Won Jun Yoon, who was a Korean exchange student, just a mile from my house in Bloomington, Indiana. And
wow,
he killed himself in a gun battle with police. So here was, just a 20-year-old kid who thought there was nothing better to do with his life than to try to start a race war. And it really shook up everything I thought I understood about being educated and the nature of hate. And within 9 months, a man from my neighborhood in Pittsburgh went to my high school, a few years older than me, does the same thing. And he follows the same pattern. He started by murdering a Jewish neighbor, desecrating a synagogue. He then murdered a black man in a karate dojo and then attacked immigrant communities or Asian American communities with roots in India and Vietnam at a grocery store and restaurant. Ended up killing people.
Could I stop you and ask you, what years were these shootings?
Yeah, so July 4th weekend, 1999, and then spring of 2000. So this was within 9 months. And then if I thought maybe this was an anomaly, it told me it was a pattern. And as I began to explore, I realized it was the same pattern, right? It was attacking Jewish communities, black communities, and Asian communities. And this was a Nazi idea, right? This was the Untermensch idea, the underman, the subhuman. And as I began to dig into this, I was thinking, gosh, if this was 55 years after the Holocaust ended, can we really say it's over if this same hate is still motivating people to kill and attack? And that was really sobering for me. I ended up switching fields from archaeology and classics into education. I wanted to understand, how do people fall for this stuff and what can we do about it? What kind of education could we provide that would help people, prevent them from falling into these belief systems, or even help to get them out if they had fallen for it? I was struck by the fact that these 2 shooters on paper were indistinguishable from me. These were straight white kids from northern suburban high schools, largely segregated schools, high-performing, well-respected high schools, went to major public state universities like, Penn State and the University of Illinois, Indiana University. And that was really sobering because my stereotypes of who the haters were kind of shaved head, Nazi tattoo, pointy hat kind of people. And that's not who these 2 were. These 2 were indistinguishable from me, which forced me to confront the question, what if I had grown up in the wrong family or fallen down the wrong rabbit hole and, had fallen for some of these crazy ideas? I would be a threat not just to communities, but even to myself and to my family. And was there anyone who would have helped me, get out of that? And thinking about my education, I didn't think there was anything in my education that would have changed my mind or, altered my views. And that concerned me.
Wow. Yeah, and as you're mentioning these shootings, it's not lost on me that there was a mass shooting yesterday at Florida State University, and these things have become so common, and even the hate motivated mass shootings have become so common that, I mean, I don't know if it's a function of me not having been old enough to be paying attention yet, but I don't think I ever heard of either of the incidents that you mentioned until I visited the Anne Frank Center. It
Right.
just, to me, that just speaks to how pervasive this problem still is.
That's a great point, and it really struck me also because as a native Pittsburgher, when the Tree of Life attack occurred, it was so disturbing. But for me, it was an echo, right, of the attack on the synagogue in Chicago. I think it might have been the fact that my student who perpetrated that shooting wasn't actually in the building. They were walking to services, so people didn't remember it as another attack on a synagogue, although in many ways I feel it was. But the pervasiveness of it is so horrifying. These, since Columbine, the kind of just constant stream of school shootings is in our consciousness, and it makes me reflect on the way that it must have felt this way in Eastern Europe during the era of pogroms, right? Another pogrom just happening so frequently. Just as in this country in the 20s and 30s, we had, another lynching yesterday. I hope that, we can turn that tide. We're going to keep trying.
Which lynching are you referencing?
Well, just the pervasiveness of lynching in
Yeah.
that period. I think during that time, it felt like, what were there, 4,000 lynchings or something? That it was just a regular occurrence,
Right.
just as, there was such a pervasive occurrence of pogroms before World War II that, it was basically genocidal. But because it's eclipsed by the Holocaust, we often lose sight of the degree and extent of the violence in that region in that period. But we have to remember that was really one of the pillars of where the Holocaust came from.
Yeah. Say more about that. It's interesting because here in Charleston, we have a really old Jewish community, and the different generations, depending on when they came to Charleston, had different attitudes about so many social issues, and it is based on their family's experiences. So, for the Jews that have been in Charleston from the 18th century and the 19th century, they didn't react the same way to racial inequality that folks that had run from the pogroms at the turn of the century coming to Charleston had, and they have very, very different views of all this. But it's interesting that you draw the connection between the pogroms and the lynchings, because I think for many Jews who ran from the pogroms and came to the States and saw what was happening in terms of Jim Crow, they felt that connection very strongly, and I've heard them talk about it.
That's right. That's right. Well, it's one of these complicated and fascinating issues and challenges. The Jewish community was forced from its homeland so long ago, and has essentially had to navigate other societies all over the world and seek safety within that context. So in those different environments and those different experiences of Jewish communities all over the world, having to navigate those challenges, seeking safety, being predominantly among them, that different awareness and sensitivities arise. So those who were subjected to a racial ideology, which is what happened in the Nazi era, right? There was so much anti-Semitism, especially in the East, predominantly was religiously motivated anti-Semitism. But the racial ideologies that were circulating, in the early part of the 1900s were picked up by the Nazis and then applied to the Jewish people. So when you look specifically at Nazi anti-Semitism, the Nazis were operating from a racial ideology as well as building on the existing anti-Semitism in the regions where they predominantly perpetrated the Holocaust. Because anti-Semitism is a big umbrella, it can feel like one thing, but in fact, it has diverse motivations and diverse manifestations. And because of that, these different strains of anti-Semitism, combine and reinforce each other in horrible ways. But we do have to be aware and disentangle these threads a little bit in order to tackle them. I think it was Rabbi Jonathan Sachs who said, hatred always starts with the Jews, but it doesn't end there. And my experience certainly reinforced for me that these hatreds are entwined and entangled in complicated ways. And I think we have to tackle them as such. And because these hatreds are entangled with anti-Semitism, it means we can find partners who recognize, and racism is bad for all of us. Anti-Semitism is bad for all of us. And the nightmare of the Tree of Life attack, the attacker was angry at the Jewish people for bringing Muslims to the U.S. So it was actually, in some ways, Islamophobia that, again, hurt the Jewish community, because that hatred combined with conspiracy theories about Jews controlling the world and pulling the strings, allegedly to bring more Muslims to the U.S., that motivated that attack. So these hatreds are entangled, and by recognizing that, I think it gives us some tools to help to try to tackle them and gain allies in the fight to tackle them, and bring more people into the fight against anti-Semitism.
So, we have a question in the chat, and this is another question we could probably talk about for an hour alone. But how is anti-Semitism today different or the same as in earlier times? Obviously, since 10/7, and we've seen kind of different manifestations of anti-Semitism, despite there being able to draw a very clear line between them and historical anti-Semitism. There's been a lot of discussion about like where what the line is, and whether we're seeing like a new kind of anti-Semitism and how it's connected to like the classical anti-Semitism that drove the Nazis.
Yes, this is such an important question, and it is it is like a disease that can keep evolving and changing. And so each year we get a new flu shot, right? Because the various viruses we're trying to fight have evolved. Anti-Semitism seems to operate the same way. So we have a long history of religious anti-Semitism in Europe that then had the complexity of the racial anti-Semitism added to it. You get then this kind of nihilist millennial anti-Semitism of a Hamas that's a nightmare, and then you get folks who through ignorance don't recognize the kind of genocidal anti-Semitism of Hamas. You've got another level to deal with. So I'm not an expert on the forms that it's taking at the moment, but I do believe that folks becoming aware of some of the historical forms can become sensitized in ways that protect them from its emerging manifestations. And at the Anne Frank Center, we work to try to bring first-year students through for tours. And we have a course at the university called University 101, and the instructors all have the freedom to choose what experiences they give to their students. but 2/3 of them choose to bring them to the Anne Frank Center. And I hope that
Wow.
by becoming sensitized to that situation, that the majority of students at USC, we've been through 4 classes now, have been through and had a tour to learn about the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. And I hope that that's an awareness they bring with them to the present, because there's 16, 17 million Jewish people in the entire world, which means there's 100 Christians, 100 Muslims, 100 citizens of China, 100 citizens of India for every single Jewish person in the world. So population-wise, it's really quite small. So for us to be able to bring that focus, because the extent and spread of anti-Semitism in the world is just wildly out of proportion to the reality of the Jewish population and community in the world, and so we need that attention to it.
Well, to me, it sounds like a unique success. The program that you're running in University of South Carolina. I mean, do you say 2/3 of incoming students are experiencing the Anne Frank Center?
Right. So not every single student has to take this incoming course. So most of them do. 2/3 of all their instructors do choose to bring the students to the Anne Frank Center for a tour. The result is cumulatively about more than half, I believe, of all undergraduates at the University of South Carolina Columbia campus have had a tour of the center, and we keep working to welcome more members of the student body, more members of the community, staff, city, and beyond.
Well, I mean, congratulations. That's a kol hakavod, as we would say. That's an incredible achievement, and I mean, to think that so many students that are just getting their start at University of South Carolina get to experience this telling of Anne Frank's story through the lenses that you bring to the discussion is just amazing. Speaking of which, obviously the Anne Frank Center's audience, mostly, unlike a lot of other Holocaust programming, is not mostly the Jewish community. It's mostly people outside of the Jewish community, and to a large extent, the folks giving the tours at the Anne Frank Center are not themselves Jewish, but feel very connected to the story. Why tell the story through Anne Frank's lens? Why tell it in a way that includes information about, how it connects to American racism? Why have you chosen to do what you do the way you do it?
That's right. Well, thank you. There's probably 5 rich threads to follow there. So let me go back a little bit to a topic we started with, which is how the center came to be here in South Carolina. So I had these experiences and wanted to better understand how we can protect ourselves, all of us, from these hateful ideologies that are out there and stereotypes and whatnot. And, I had a flyer thrown in my driveway. By the time we get to Dillon Roof, right, this hate material is just a click away. And I would talk about it in those terms really until a few weeks ago, when I came to understand it's not just a click away anymore. It's getting pushed at us by the algorithms that are out there. So I saw some very disturbing data on TikTok. If you sign up for a TikTok account and as a teenage boy express some interest in, typically male things like gym tips or something along this kind, you end up getting some pretty disturbing sexist material in under 10 minutes. And if you so much as show interest and watch a video to the end, it gets fed to you more systematically. So within half an hour, you're getting some really troubling stuff. And over time, within a couple of weeks, you're fully immersed in a whole disturbing ecosystem of this kind of material. And our, kids in the United States are averaging more than 4 hours per day on their phone. So you can imagine how quickly they're having this stuff pushed at them. And we hope that, with one lesson on Holocaust education in middle school, somehow they have the filters to resist all this stuff getting shoveled at them. It's just not the case anymore. So we have to think differently about how we help young people navigate the new digital world that they're a part of. Because yeah, it's not a flyer in your driveway you have to get from an obscure PO box in the back of disturbing magazines. It's not even just a click away anymore. But the efforts to restrict this stuff on the internet from poisoning the minds of young people, it's just it's getting shoveled at us now.
Yeah,
so that was,
I mean,
I wanted to just mention that point about the materials that are getting shoveled at us. And your question had many interesting components. One is getting back to how we ended up with this at USC. So I began trying to understand, what kind of education we need to protect ourselves from this. And I ended up working in Central and Eastern Europe, especially Estonia, and it was Central and Eastern Europe where most of the crimes of the Holocaust were perpetrated. But then they were under the communist thumb. So they, for 50 years, didn't have the freedom to confront it, even if they wanted to. And I'm not telling you the will was there to confront it either. So when I began to recognize the challenge of combating anti-Semitism after the collapse of the communist era, it was not an easy thing to do. People had their own historical experiences and beliefs, and they don't change their minds just by arguing with them. That's where I really came to appreciate the power of sharing a story. And the Anne Frank House pioneered this idea of traveling exhibits back in the 80s, realizing people have a powerful experience coming to Amsterdam, but most people can never go. So with these traveling exhibits, they were behind the Iron Curtain in Poland in the 80s. It's an exceptional outreach effort. And one thing that happens when you share Anne's experience from her own point of view in her own words, you don't argue about that in the same way you argue about politics. This is somebody's authentic experience, and people who might, argue about whether the Soviets or Nazis were worse, that's not terribly productive. But when you understand that a 13-year-old girl had to hide because her government was trying to kill her, and see her struggle to make sense of the world where that's her life, that's something that sinks in and helps you make sense of it, produces that cognitive dissonance. So I really found that the Anne Frank House's ability to share a story, an authentic, accurate story, was part of what helped people reassess their understandings of the Second World War, the evil of the Nazis, recognize the crimes of the Holocaust. But the Anne Frank House did something too. They understood the power of a young person's voice. It's extraordinary that one of the most read nonfiction works in the history of the world was written by a 14, 15-year-old Jewish girl. Because if you read the diary in school like I did, that was the only time I was learning from somebody my own age. The only time I was relating to somebody who was in an utterly different world, but nevertheless was also a teenager, somebody who kind of had that level of maturity. And that's unique. Our young people today, they all know the negative power of peer pressure, but what they don't get is that message that their voices matter, what they say and how they interact with each other matters, and they have the potential to help bring out the best in one another. The Anne Frank House, by recognizing that potential and power, doesn't just share Anne's story. They go into communities and they prepare the students to be the guides for the exhibit. So they're the ones talking to one another about this. And it's so important for us to help young people learn to talk about these difficult issues, because they're less likely to listen to an old talking head like me. But when they're learning from people their own age, it's a different experience and they respond to it differently. So that's one of the reasons I turned my career over to this work, was these traveling exhibits. The peer education program was one of the most impactful things I'd ever seen.
Well, we've got a great question here from my colleague, Arian Greenblatt Boynton, who is our Director of Development, our Chief Development Officer, and also our former Remember Program Director. So she asks, can you talk more about the connection between Anne's story and local civil rights and racism at the Anne Frank Center?
That's right. So let me preface this by saying that, there was a scandal when Whoopi Goldberg, said the Holocaust had nothing to do with race. But that viewpoint's actually pretty widespread. And I'm not here to beat up on Whoopi. She's a person of goodwill. And, when there was a postcard written by Anne Frank that was sent to a girl in Iowa as a pen pal, went on the market. She was actually one of the people bidding to purchase that postcard. So she is interested and engaged. But this misunderstanding comes from the American experience of race, right? The American experience of race is largely this black-white lens. And that seems natural or intrinsic or real in the American experience, because the reality is our skin colors are different, right? It feels like it's part of nature. But the idea of race is that there's a whole hierarchy built into that. And we know today from science, right, that we have superficial physical differences. But back when they were imagining this concept of race, the idea was some groups of people are naturally better than others, physically, morally, intellectually. Now we know there's no basis for that. That idea of biological race as us being fundamentally different is wrong. And the fact that the Nazis could take over this idea of race, but not link it to skin color in the same way, and instead argue that the Jewish people were a different race and a threat to the alleged Aryan race, shows us just how incoherent this is. So an American with Whoopi Goldberg's experience growing up in the US might walk into the Anne Frank Center and look at Anne's portrait on the wall and think, oh, this is a white girl, right? And we can teach 12-year-olds to be able to respond accurately and say, yes, from our experience looking at her, if she were here alive today, she might be looked at and treated as a white person. But that wasn't the identity that was foisted upon her where she lived. She was never called white, right? She was called Jewish and regarded as a race, not a religion. And she was murdered for being Jewish. So 12-year-olds in 6th grade are able to explain clearly that the same person could be relatively privileged on one side of the Atlantic and on the other side of the Atlantic be murdered for her racial identity. Her supposed racial identity, right? And that fact shows you that race isn't just kind of the American interpretation of it, but it was an idea that was taken and distorted and applied. It's distorted everywhere, but distorted in different ways, and applied to the Jewish people with such destructive results. So understanding that, I think, helps us to give some picture, because when we think about black and white identities, well, we associate it with this category of race, but this old idea of race as we're fundamentally different, isn't true. So we need to think about black and white identity maybe in a new way, and thinking about it as potentially through a cultural lens helps us, because the only thing we can tell about one another by looking at each other is that we might have been treated differently, right? We can't judge people by looking at them. We can only be aware that our experiences might have been different. And, that's certainly the case for, I go to my parking garage at night and I'm scrolling through my phone. Well, that's not my wife's experience, right? She's on high alert walking through the parking garage at night. We have different experiences, and that can result in seeing things in different ways. So a cultural lens helps us think about how do we understand one another, and not how do we judge one another by looking at each other. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to not judge people by looking at one another. We're trying to better understand one another by thinking about ourselves in cultural terms.
Yeah, I'm interested to hear, obviously a lot of what you've said is kind of baked into the presentation at the Anne Frank Center. And I'm interested to hear what are the kinds of questions and reactions that you get from students that are touring? Are these concepts really landing with them and resonating with them? And if so, like what kind of questions are they asking when they're experiencing these tours?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'd like to refer, first of all, to law enforcement. And we've been so gratified by the response of law enforcement. So we've had numerous tours from the FBI, local law enforcement agencies of all kinds. And, for us, it's really important for us to help police organizations understand the different forms of anti-Semitism, because it's not obvious to many Americans that one of the top threats against Jewish communities actually comes from racist extremists, right? Because the reality of Jewish communities is that it's largely a religious community. And so it seems logical that the hatred would be a religious hatred. But in fact, it's very often, the kind of KKK types, the racist groups, the neo-Nazis, that have a racial ideology that targets the Jewish people. So when law enforcement understands that it's not just a religiously motivated hatred targeting the Jewish people, right? It's based on these racial fantasies. That helps them better understand and support communities, because they have a better understanding of what the threat is. So legal agencies like that often give challenge coins to recognize people who are doing good work in their view. And we're very proud of the rack of challenge coins we've accumulated from the FBI, different law enforcement organizations. And it is the reality that race is a complicated and sensitive thing to talk about. And a lot of teachers shy away from it. One reason is that they've never had it kind of explained clearly. Well, what is it we're actually talking about? It's not like part of nature that we can describe accurately and say, okay, this is what race is. It's a social category that got applied to people. So we have to be able to say, look, it was the idea that some groups of people were inherently better than others, right? That's what the word used to mean. We know that's not true. So if you say that clearly, you can take a step in the right direction. And that's helpful because my experience has taught me it's tempting to stay away from uncomfortable topics, but it's more dangerous to avoid them than to try to tackle them clearly.
Absolutely. So are there any parts that student of the tour and of Anne Frank's story you think that students have trouble absorbing or is challenging for people to experience?
That's a great question. So we're trying to figure out what the impact of our tours are, because we get wonderful feedback, and we get some indicators. So let me give one example. We did a survey of students who came through the exhibit, and we wondered whether it was producing conversations. And the students who responded to the survey, 95% of them said that they had discussed their visit to the Anne Frank Center with somebody outside their class. So discussing with roommates or with family. So it's stimulating conversations. To me, that's a very good sign. But when we talk about the educational hierarchy of goals, right, it's easy for me to share a fact, right? I point out in the tour that Anne Frank's father, Otto Frank, was born 3 weeks after Hitler. So Otto Frank and Hitler were the same age. It's a trivial fact, but it's easy to transmit a fact. People may be able to remember that. Developing skills is harder, but we're pretty good at it as a society. So a special skill we'd like to help people develop is how to critique a propaganda photo, right? How to recognize what the message is, how it's trying to be manipulative. That's a skill we can develop. But the deeper stuff, attitudes and dispositions at the one level, and the deeper still, the impact on future behavior, those are difficult to measure in part because everybody knows not to say you're anti-Semitic. So if we just ask people, are you anti-Semitic? They're going to typically say no, because that's the socially expected answer. So it's very difficult to measure whether people are actually anti-Semitic and how you have an impact on that. there are some efforts in that direction, but it's not an easy thing to measure. So assessing what the actual impact is on a deep level, we're not certain, but we do hope and believe that we're contributing to a more positive culture on campus for recognizing and standing up against expressions of anti-Semitism, bigotry generally, and building a community that's better at cultural understanding.
Well, I have to just express gratitude, because as a Jewish person, and as somebody that works for an organization that's engaged deeply in Holocaust education through so many different modalities, to know that you are in Columbia exposing students to this program and tackling education around the Holocaust in such a novel way. I really do think it's going to take all of these different ways that we're used to talking about anti-Semitism and Holocaust education, and new innovative ways, and more ways that aren't at our disposal yet, to really drive the message home. And I think it's more relevant than it ever has been before. And I was struck. I was struck by during your tour, and even at the dinner table this past Saturday night or Friday night for the first Seder, and reading the Haggadah, and just how many themes from our history are just always repeating themselves, and how important it is for us as people living in this moment to identify those things that are happening again, that we need to look out for, and social trends, and propaganda, as you mentioned, and being able to identify whether something is accurate or not accurate. I mean, the internet era that you kind of described through the lens of social media algorithms on TikTok. And it's hard sometimes, I think, people to sift through what is accurate, what is fake. It's a difficult task, but I think one of the ways that people can do that is by looking at history, and really having an understanding for how folks with bad intent have gone about convincing large groups of people to do things that they know, that you would think they know, are wrong.
That's right.
But I so appreciate. I'm sorry, we had a little bit of a delay there. Go ahead.
No, I thank you for that. One of the things that's a real risk is you can teach, about the Holocaust, and it was something done to Jewish people, done to the Jewish community, but you can study the Holocaust and really learn very little about real Jewish people and the reality of Jewish life and Jewish communities and Jewish culture. And we don't want to teach death, right? We want to teach life. We want to help understand the communities that existed and were targeted. And that's one reason I appreciate the diary, is this is the authentic voice of a Jewish girl confronting this world. So we do get access to that. And that's the first story we share. It's important that we make clear that's not the story of being Jewish. The Anne Frank House has opened a traveling exhibit in New York City with 150 artifacts, and it's an extraordinary exhibit. But it helps, I think, do some things that aren't often done. One is that it brings the lives of Margot and Edith into stronger focus, and Edith's side of the family. And Edith and Margot were frankly more observant than Otto and Anne were. So there were diverse ways of being Jewish just within a single family. And we like to help bring that to people's attention, because I fear when we just talk about the 6 million Jewish victims of the Holocaust, we can leave the impression that that group was more homogenous, than the reality was. Most of the victims were Orthodox Yiddish-speaking Jews of Poland and the East. And if Anne Frank had ever encountered any of them in camps in Auschwitz or Bergen-Belsen, for example, they couldn't have even had a conversation because they didn't have a language in common. So the diversity of the Jewish people in Europe, I think, is something that we like to try to help get across in terms of cultural appreciation. One thing I appreciate related to what you said is I love the way that there's an annual cycle in retelling and revisiting the story of the Jewish people. And one thing I think that does is that the circumstances we're living in keep changing. So different parts of that history become more salient each year, or salient in different ways. And I know we've certainly felt that after October 7th, when, confronted with this, genocidal anti-Semitism. Again, the desire just to kill as many people as they could, and feeling there was nothing better they could do with their lives. That was just a horrific reminder of the extreme anti-Semitism that exists out there. Where we live, what we can do, the difference we can make in our communities. We'd love to invite members of the Charleston community to come visit us at the Anne Frank Center. If you can bring some friends, we can arrange tours for individual level. And just to remind that that's what we do in the building is about 20% of our work. We're the headquarters for the Anne Frank House work for the United States and Canada. We run 18 traveling exhibits. We have them circulating in schools. We'd be delighted to bring them to school communities around the Charleston area. If you have educators or people involved in PTAs that would like to help us get into schools and communities, we'd be delighted to do that. So I hope folks will, come try to learn a little more about us.
Well, we have a mutual interest here, because I love to get folks up to Columbia to talk to their legislators. I think that so many people, don't know who their state representatives and senators are, and we live in a time where so much is decided at the state level for a number of reasons, and I don't think people know how they can just kind of pop in to their representative's office, and in terms of thinking global and acting local, there's a great amount of impact that can be had by talking to your legislators. And while you're up there in Columbia, go to the Anne Frank Center, cap off your day, or start your day rooted in the story of Anne Frank. I mean, I think these things go hand in hand to some extent. And I've had such great experiences in the tour. I don't think I mentioned it in this conversation, but my grandmother was a little girl in Amsterdam in around the same time period as Anne Frank, and she was one of the lucky ones. She got to make a home in Canada just before the Nazi invasion, and in terms of these recurring themes, I mean, of Pesach and of and in talking about the Holocaust here, I often hear the phrase in my head, "Here, but for the grace of God, go we," and it's so important, I think, to remember how lucky we are that we get to live in a place like South Carolina, and in Charleston, where our Jewish people have been so welcomed, and we still face challenges. If folks want to visit the Anne Frank Center, what days are y'all open, and what are your hours like?
Thank you for that. So I wanted to point out, we do everything by guided tour, both because we're trying to help young people become good advocates and comfortable speaking about this, but also we feel it's the human connection that is where change happens. So we'd love to have folks come in, but we do things by guided tour. So you can find on our website, annefrankcenter.com, the time and schedule where regular tours are available. But if you're coming with a group and there's not one available, please reach out to us to see if we can schedule a private tour. We'd love to do that. And I especially wanted to echo your remarks about the State House. So number one, we're able to do what we do thanks so much to the support of the State House. And so many of our representatives and senators have come through for tours and stepped up to support us, the governor included. we're really grateful for that support. So when you do come to the State House, meet and talk to your representatives, thank them for helping to make our work possible, because we couldn't do it without them.
Absolutely. And kudos to you also. I know that I show up in a lot of government spaces where the Holocaust is being discussed and anti-Semitism is being discussed, and you are a constant presence in those spaces. And I know that your work doesn't just stop at the walls of the Anne Frank Center, but really you do an incredible amount of advocacy. And when we think about the righteous Gentiles, you know, you pop up in my head as a modern day righteous Gentile, and I just, speaking from the perspective of the Jewish community, just so grateful for the work that you endeavor to do every day, and how you've chosen to spend your career. So with that, I think now is a good time to cap off our conversation. Is there anything that you want to get across that you haven't been able to get across yet?
No, thank you for this opportunity to speak with you, to share the message out with the community. We're really grateful for it, and your kind words mean a lot. We really want to be a good friend and ally for the Jewish community. So I'm grateful for your compliments and kind words.
Well, I hope everybody will take some time to visit center, and I was watching. Have a great of your.
All right, thank you. We'll look forward to seeing you down the road. Bye-bye.
Legislators who be and apologies. Had a little bit of a connection problem there, but yeah, next month, May 17th, we'll be joined by Beth Bernstein. She is a representative from the Columbia area, the sole Jewish legislator in the General Assembly, and she'll be joining us to talk about the South Carolina Pray Safe Act, which she filed this year with some support from your local Jewish federations, and she'll be talking about what she feels her role is as a Jewish legislator, what drove her to a life of public service, what about that drive is Jewish, and what to expect moving forward with the Pray Safe Act, with the hate crimes bill, with so much else going on in the South Carolina General Assembly in the next year. All of that. Hope to see you then. Shabbat Shalom. Hag Sameach. We'll talk soon. This has been Bridges Not Walls.